Welcome to the Minneapolis Parks Foundation first virtual Next Generation of Parks lecture. Thank you for all joining. I hope you can hear me well. My name is Tom Evers. I'm the Executive Director of the Minneapolis Parks Foundation, and we're really thrilled you all have chosen to join us tonight. Happy Hanukkah to everyone, especially to those who celebrate. We're excited to spend the night with you here talking about an amazing book and hearing a little bit about the endangered species that live in Minnesota. As I said, this is our first virtual Next Generation of Parks event, and I really miss seeing you all in person. So we look forward to the time when we can share space again, but thanks for making time. Before we bring on our guest, I want to just say a few words about the Minneapolis Parks Foundation and about our work, and then a little bit about how tonight will flow. So the Minneapolis Parks Foundation, we are an independent nonprofit, entirely donor supported. So many of you who are with us tonight, thank you so much for your contributions to help us to do this work. We are here and our mission is to transform human lives through parks and public space by aligning philanthropic investment with community vision. And really, we know this year more than ever, we've seen how parks are critical to our health and well-being, how important they are to everyday life. We know that parks connect us, they heal us, they make us whole. And the Parks Foundation is here to help inspire that here in Minneapolis. We are the philanthropic partner to the Minneapolis Park and Rec Board, the agency, the public body that is responsible for managing, operating, owning, programming, activating, and sustaining our park system here in Minneapolis. We partner with many partners throughout the city, the stakeholders, many community groups, nonprofits, but we also work with other agencies, the city of Minneapolis, Hennepin County, state of Minnesota, including the National Park Service, which, as most of you know, Minneapolis and in the heart of the Twin Cities, we have a national park. So with that, a little bit more about our work. The Next Generation of Parks events is one of our ongoing series. This is our 11th season, and we are so thrilled to be able to continue this even virtually. But we do work throughout the city. Many of you are familiar with our work at River First, and two projects particularly that we're excited to celebrate in 2021, the Waterworks project in the heart of downtown Central Riverfront, as well as the Great Northern Greenway overlook up in North Minneapolis. And we will continue to work with the park board and the city and partners to create more parks along the river. But we work throughout the park system and work with partners to ensure that investments and philanthropy can be delivered into the park system. We partner with national organizations. We're part of a Reimagining Civic Commons, which includes 10 cities looking at how the civic spaces in major cities, parks, libraries, and museums, and how they are fostering healthy community life, and particularly parks. And we also, this past year, have forged a unique and new partnership and merged with a longstanding grassroots organization, People for Parks, and have founded the People for Parks Fund to deliver contributions to deliver philanthropy to projects throughout the park system. And we'll share more about that in the new year and begin granting out in 2021. So we do a lot in Minneapolis, and we would not be able to do that without your support. So thank you for those who donate and contribute. If you can make a donation, please do at our website, which is, you can go to www.mplsparksfoundation.org and /donate, parksfoundation.org/donate. You'll see it on our screen here and there. Feel free to make a donation there so we can continue this work. But one of the features of the Next Generation of Park Lecture Series is it is free and open to the public, because we know it is critical to have a shared conversation about how parks are dynamic and how they transform our lives. Also, if you do make a donation tonight, I do want to note that we will put everybody who makes a donation of $25 or more into a drawing, and whoever pull a name out, and that person will win a copy of Adam Arvidson's book, the one we'll be talking about, Wild and Rare. And a special thanks to Majors and Quinn Booksellers, who is our partner on this. They've made sure they had copies of this book available, and we'll work with folks to get that there. We need to support our local bookstores as well. So with that, I'm really excited for tonight to introduce you to Adam Arvidson. He is a phenomenal author and an incredible parks thinker and planner. We're very lucky to have him as part of the Minneapolis park system. Adam is a nonfiction writer, a landscape architect living in Minneapolis. He has appeared in publications ranging from Landscape Architecture Magazine to Michigan Quarterly Review to Flyway Journal of Writing and the Environment. He's the founder of SCAPE, the magazine of Minnesota chapter of American Society of Landscape Architects, and served as the interim editor of Landscape Architecture magazine. He was awarded the Bradford Williams Medal for Excellence in Writing about Landscape Architecture. He's won numerous regional design awards and recently served in the National Landscape Architecture Student Awards jury. Adam's the author of the book we'll be talking about tonight, his book, Wild and Rare, Tracking Endangered Species in the Upper Midwest and Greening the Landscape, Strategies for Environmentally Sound Practices. But he also serves professionally. He is helping shape the park system. He is the director of strategic planning for the Minneapolis Park and Rec Board. And really, as a resident in Minneapolis, really is thinking about the spaces that shape us. And that we need to think about parks as our connection to nature in the city. Without it, it's critically important. And I want to just say, if you haven't had a chance to read the book, it is phenomenal. This book gives us this panoramic view of Minnesota, the history of the people who have been here before, who are shaping it today, and a story of the species that are unique to the threatened and are threatened to the highest degree. In the book, he talks about folks we know, names like Eloise Butler and her pursuit of wildflowers. He has this stunningly vivid portrait of the sea of grass that once covered our state and the efforts to really measure the land in Minnesota. It's truly a natural history of Minnesota, so I highly recommend it. So Adam, I'm going to have you come on because I think folks really want to hear from you as you go. Thank you for making time. As folks come on, I want to do a couple more things, and then I'm going to hand it over to you, Adam. The first is that there will be a poll that comes on your screen here. And really what it is if folks will see it, you'll have a chance to pick a topic that you are interested in having him read from after his talk. This will gives us a sense of what folks are interested in. So go ahead and click on a button there. If you use your scroller, you can scroll up and down. There's a couple more that might be off the window, but go ahead and click it. We're going to close in a couple moments here. And so what's going to happen for the rest of the night, just so folks know as they're filling it in, Adam's going to share with us some of his findings from his book, talk about the species, talk about the book, and then do a couple readings at the end of the book in his time there. Then he's going to be joined by Jeanette Aldrich Law from the Minneapolis Parks Foundation for a conversation, and we'll take questions from all of you. You can submit questions. Down below is a Q&A section where you can hit a button and submit questions, and that'll help us inform the conversation. And feel free to do that. So thank you. We will conclude around 8 o'clock. We don't mean to keep this going forever into the night. We really appreciate the time you have. So with that, Adam, are you, I think folks are filling in the screen here on the poll. Thank you so much for joining us, Adam. I'm going to turn it over to you and let you take some time to share with folks some of the amazing parts of your book. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. And you know, I have followed the Next Generation of Parks series for quite some time, as you might expect. And it's a real honor to sort of put my name amongst many of the thinkers and writers and scientists that you've had share this space. So thank you for the opportunity, and I look forward to talking about this.
Awesome.
So the book Wild and Rare is, as Tom really accurately described, it's a journey across Minnesota. It's a book about endangered species, and it really begins with a list. The endangered species list is a big one. And it was created by federal legislation. And I'm big into lists. So part of my role at the Minneapolis Park and Recreation Board is I'm sort of tracking the lists of implementation projects that we are working on. I submit bonding lists to the state for funding. I work on organizing the capital improvement plan, which is a really big list of lots of projects that we work on. So I'm big into lists. And the book really originated when I was on a trip to Ely, to the International Wolf Center. And I was there doing some research for an article for Landscape Architecture magazine. And while there, I heard wolves howl for really the first time. And I was mesmerized by that. It's an extraordinary sound. Even though these were essentially captive wolves at the Wolf Center, they felt no less wild than if I'd heard them kind of across the winter landscape of the North Woods. So I also at the time visited the excellent exhibit that they have there about wolves and humans and the history of that interaction. And I was so taken by it that over dinner and a beer later at a downtown Ely watering hole, I started thinking about the endangered species list and what it meant for a species to be on that list. And so I just did a quick check and I looked up what were the federally listed species in Minnesota. And at the time, now this was about 12 years ago, at the time there were 12 federally listed species. And they spanned all corners of the state, from the streams of the Southwest to the bluffs of the Southeast, up to Zipple Bay in the very north on Lake of the Woods. And they also touched on so many different types of relationships that we have with the landscape. These species were endangered or had been touched by humans through outright persecution, through somewhat inadvertent farming practices, through recreation, through even our urban rivers and whether they were clean or dirty. And so I thought if you took this list in total, would it give a picture of the state and would it give a picture of our relationship with the natural world in the upper Midwest? So over the course of my research, which took about 9 years to research and another year to write the book and pull it together, the list of endangered species in Minnesota has grown. There are now 18. Until just momentarily ago, there were 19, and I'll talk about that in a moment. And they continue to show the sometimes complicated relationship between humans and the natural environment. And I'll start with a story of this little guy here. So this is not a moth. This is a butterfly. This is called a Powashiek skipperling. It's a really fun name. It's named after a county in Iowa, which is in turn named for a Meskwaki chief. The Powashiek skipperling is a butterfly that was extremely ubiquitous on the prairie. So much so that naturalists in the field throughout the 70s, 80s, and 90s really didn't even take note of it. For any of you birders out there, it would be like maybe the time you just don't always log the chickadee on your list. It was that common. But in the mid 2000s, some folks started noticing that maybe they actually weren't seeing the Powashiek skipperling in those prairie walks so much anymore. And so naturalists began to compare notes, and it turned out that not many people at all were seeing them. And that initiated a bit of a study in 2008. And they did not find a single Powashiek skipperling in the state of Minnesota. Minnesota was home to more than 50% of this butterfly's range in the world. It was the core habitat area. So that study fanned out, and no Powashieks were found in the Dakotas either. Today, there are remnant populations that still exist in small places in Michigan and Wisconsin and in Manitoba. But this butterfly that used to be as common as the chickadee or the squirrel is gone from Minnesota. And to not totally bring everybody down with that story, I think that the Powashiek skipperling illustrates something that's important about the Endangered Species Act, which is that the Endangered Species Act is not about the charismatic megafauna. It's not about polar bears and tigers. It is about those things, but it's also about every species that is threatened with extinction can get onto this list with a basis in science, and its recovery can be planned by scientists and policy managers over time. And in a lot of cases, that recovery has a lot to do with our parks, whether it is state parks or city parks or scientific and natural areas, which in Minnesota are kind of the backbone of our natural resource preservation efforts. And also parks like the Minnesota Zoo, where the Poweshiek skipperling is getting a head start. There's a couple of researchers there who are working with the Poweshiek skipperling and its relative. Another prairie butterfly, the Dakota skipper, to create backup populations. And in the case of the Dakota skipper, to begin to reintroduce them back into the wild. So if humans can have a deleterious effect on these animals, we can, through this type of legislation, actually help them rebound as well. And I think the endangered species story in the upper Midwest is full of these. Here's another fun one. That's my hand holding a snuff box mussel. The snuff box mussel is pretty amazing because the mussel life cycle is truly extraordinary. And I'll maybe make a mention of it in a minute. But this picture was taken in a laboratory down in Lake City, where Mike Davis and the Department of Natural Resources are propagating endangered mussels. So he handed this mussel to me from a bin, and I was holding it, and it's like a little pebble. It feels really good in the hand, even though that's a living creature, right? And he looks at me and he says, you're one of about a dozen people in the world who's ever held one of those. These are extremely rare and hard to find because they're down at the bottom of the rivers. And yet here we have people in Minnesota who are actively propagating them, learning their life histories, figuring out how they can survive and thrive, and putting them back in the wild, including in Minneapolis parks. And then there's this one right here. This is a plant. Obviously, endangered species are not just animals, but plants as well. This is a lilies roseroot. And you may have seen this on the promotional literature for this particular talk. This plant is fascinating. It grows on a sheer cliff face in southeastern Minnesota. You can only get there by basically schlepping a ladder down into a river valley and then climbing that ladder, which is propped against slopes. And you have to wear a bicycle helmet because the rocks tend to kind of break off and might get you from above. So it's a fairly inhospitable environment. This plant is left over from the Ice Age, and it only occurs in southeastern Minnesota and in upstate New York. So it's a very strange distribution range. But what's also fascinating about this plant is it's a perennial plant, but it's possible to track individuals because its root sticks out of the cliff surface, and you can tag that root. Most science around perennials can't track individual plants because they die back to the underground every year. But the lilies roseroot, there's a scientist that's been able to track the individual life histories of single plants over the course of decades. And that would only be possible if because this species is listed and gets the funding and the focus that it does by being recognized on the endangered species list. So the Endangered Species Act itself was really part of a spate of legislation in the 60s and 70s that really took a new look at the environment. There was a lot of literature that was happening at that time too. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring being the most famous, but there were many other books that were taking place at that time. They were being published at that time, including several that are near and dear to me as a landscape architect, such as Ian McHarg's Design with Nature, which foretold the advent of geographic information systems to understand site suitability for design and planning. That was published in 1969 in the heart of these environmental days. So the acts that took place at this time, we have in 1964, the Wilderness Act was passed. And in 1968, the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. And in 1970 was the National Environmental Policy Act, which really recast our relationship with the environment and actually, for the first time, began to require environmental impact statements. Clean water and clean air followed, and also in 1973 was the Endangered Species Act. What's interesting about some of these, other than the fact that they were all pretty much bipartisan bills, the Environmental Policy Act actually passed unanimously in the Senate in 1970 and was signed by President Richard Nixon, is the wording of these. There's some really beautiful writing and that I can really relate to as a writer and policy developer. I love when a good policy is also well written. So the Wilderness Act has some somewhat famous words, which talks about the earth and the community of its life being untrammeled by man. The Wild and Scenic Rivers Act is pretty pointed about dam construction specifically, and talking about rivers being preserved in their free-flowing condition. The National Environmental Policy Act talks about encouraging enjoyable and productive harmony between man and his environment. Again, this is federal legislation. I'm reading language that was passed by Congress. The Clean Air Act talked about the complexity of air pollution and the dangers to public health and welfare. So there was an admission that what was happening to the air was hurting people. The Clean Water Act actually said that we should have a national goal to cease the discharge of pollutants into the public waters by 1985. And maybe we didn't get there, but it was a strong goal. But the Endangered Species Act, I think, beats them all. In terms of the language within this, it's really an extraordinary piece of writing as well as policy. So there's three main introductory paragraphs in the Endangered Species Act. It says here right in the beginning that Congress finds and declares that various species of fish, wildlife, and plants in the United States have been rendered extinct. So an admission of that, and also a culpability. They've been rendered extinct as a consequence of economic growth and development. Think about that today and whether we are saying or taking any blame for economic growth and development as having an impact on our natural landscapes in terms of federal legislation. It also says that other species of fish, wildlife, and plants have been so depleted that they are in danger or threatened with extinction. And then lastly, it says that these species of fish, wildlife, and plants are of aesthetic, ecological, educational, historical, recreational, and scientific value to the nation and its people. That's quite a list. And it's also saying here that, I love some of the words on here, for instance, aesthetic. For species to have aesthetic value to the nation or recreational or historical value of the nation, it opens us up to being able to notice things like the Poweshiek skipperling, like the tiny little snuffbox mussel and the lilies roseroot, alongside of noticing the wolf and the lynx and other animals that may garner a lot more press and a lot more attention. So in Minnesota, the species that we have that are on the federal endangered species list, there are two birds, the piping plover and the red knot. Both of them are migratory. The piping plover has not nested in Minnesota for decades, but it is occasionally still sighted here. The Topeka shiner is a small prairie minnow that lives only in the streams of southwestern Minnesota and then in the Missouri River Valley watershed. So in southwestern Minnesota, there's this big ridge called the Buffalo Ridge or the Prairie Coteau, and you slide over that ridge and head down further west toward Luverne and Pipestone. And all those rivers start to run toward the Missouri River, and that's where the Topeka shiner lives. There are 5 freshwater mussels on the endangered species list, all of which have extraordinary names. I mentioned the snuffbox, but we also have the Higgins eye pearly mussel. I want to give a prize to the person who named that one. The spectacle case, the sheep nose, the winged maple leaf. So spectacular names, and it doesn't stop there. The mussels as a tribe, for some reason, have garnered themselves pretty incredible names. There are several insects that are listed. I mentioned the Poweshiek skipperling and the Dakota skipper as prairie butterflies. The Karner blue butterfly formerly was found in southeastern Minnesota and is found across Wisconsin, kind of in the rolling driftless area. It exclusively needs wild lupine for pretty much every life stage. It has not been seen in Minnesota for a long period of time, but is on the upswing in Wisconsin. And then more recently, the rusty-patched bumblebee. I know there was a recent Next Generation of Parks talk where that might have been covered in some detail, but the rusty-patched bumblebee is the first continental bumblebee to be listed on the endangered species list. There are 4 plants, the Leedy's roseroot, which I mentioned, the prairie bush clover, which is probably an indicator species of the loss of our prairie landscape as a whole, the western prairie fringed orchid, Of course, orchids are sort of some of the more charismatic plants. So there are some interesting threats there to orchids, including illegal collection. And then we have the Minnesota dwarf trout lily. This is the only species that is found only in Minnesota. Its entire worldwide range constitutes about 3 counties in southeastern Minnesota. It's actually fairly easy to see, and there are parks where you can go see it, most notably Nurstrand Woods State Park, where some new boardwalks have been installed to manage the human traffic that goes right through the dwarf trout lily habitat and allows people to get close to it, but also protect it. And then we have the mammals. The northern long-eared bat is very recently listed, primarily due to the impacts of the white nose syndrome on this bat and many other bats across the eastern United States. The Canada lynx, and then the wolf. And I put the wolf in gray there, not because it's the gray wolf, but because the wolf was just delisted for the 4th time since I started writing this book 12 years ago. In the days before the most recent election, the Fish and Wildlife Service announced at the Minnesota National Wildlife Refuge Visitor Center here in Minnesota, in Bloomington, announced that the wolf across the lower 48 of the United States would be removed from the endangered species list. That will take place officially on January 2nd. Conservation groups, as they have in the past, have already filed suit to block that action. During the writing of my book, the wolf went on and off the endangered species list multiple times, including during the period where there were several wolf hunts organized in Minnesota when the species was off the list and under state management. Suffice it to say that the wolf is one of the more complicated species in terms of its relationship with humans, not just the legislation, but just the way we feel about the wolf. So I want to tell a couple of quick stories from the book about searching for endangered species in the parks, various parks. And then I'll check out those poll results and do a little reading. So I mentioned carrying a ladder down into a river valley. So here we are in the Whitewater River Valley in southeastern Minnesota, in a landscape that I had no idea existed in this state. Look at those cliffs across that river. They are sheer, straight up and down limestone cliffs. And the only way you get in here is you park in a farm field, basically. I arrived to meet these scientists, and I'm standing in a farm field with no idea that there are river valleys around me. And they unstrap this aluminum ladder from the top of the car. They put on their bicycle helmets and hand me one. And we start tromping down into the woods, down into this river valley. And then you have to climb up and get to these lilies roseroots that are clinging to the side of a cliff. I found that these dedicated scientists, this guy, Joel Olfelt, has studied the lilies roseroot for about 20 years. These dedicated scientists are passionate about their particular plant or animal, but they're also often underfunded. And so if you ask to go along as a journalist, you end up needing to help. And so that was part of the fun. So while Joel was up there counting the flowers on the lilies roseroot, I was down below taking the notes, hoping that I would not screw up his decades worth of data. This is what it looks like when you get up close. It is a type of sedum. We have a lot of ornamental sedums that we grow in our gardens. This is a native sedum that grows out of the cliff face, a veritable rainforest up there in microscopic scale. And sometimes you got to do some rock climbing. None of us were totally sure how Joel got up there to look at the lilies roseroot, but he was a master at these cliffs. I mentioned prairie butterflies before, and the work at the zoo being taken to propagate and to reintroduce them. These prairie butterflies are not the big, long distance migrating butterflies like you might think of with the monarch, for instance. Many of these prairie butterflies will not even cross a barrier as wide as a gravel road. They stay in small patches, so you can understand how habitat fragmentation can really impact them. That little wisp of what looks like cotton in the middle of that plant is actually the caterpillar spins that little nest, and they stay in there for pretty much a year and actually hibernate in caterpillar form down in that little nest. They pull strands of grass down into themselves and eat it while they're down in there. So they're homebodies, couch potatoes, and then they live as butterflies for a matter of weeks to mate, lay eggs, and start the cycle all over again. And so at the zoo, they spend their winters in these little contraptions, which I always think of as like caterpillar condos, but this kind of keeps them climate controlled, but still allows the sort of winter coolness to simulate a real world experience for them. I love plants, and I grew up being fascinated with the spring ephemeral wildflowers in particular. When I was in college, I was a docent at our on-campus woods about spring wildflowers. So I was particularly excited to learn about and do some research about the dwarf trout lily. And the way you count a dwarf trout lily, because it's tiny, is you have to flag every one of them, and then you pull out the flags and count the flags. So that's kind of fun. And there's a trout lily right there, beautiful tiny plant. The Western Prairie Fringed Orchid, these are seeds. They seem no more than black pepper. They are being, a backup population is being cultivated at the Landscape Arboretum in Minnesota. This is the second stage of an orchid. It's got a very strange life cycle also. It doesn't come out of a normal seed. It actually needs to partner with a fungus in order to successfully grow. But when it does, it's a tall and beautiful sentinel on the prairie, pollinated by moths at night. I tracked lynx. These are lynx tracks. That is my glove. The lynx is a huge-footed animal that is so light on the snow. Where I'm standing right there, I am hip deep in the snow, and the lynx is just floating across it. And then I want to say a few words about mussels. So this picture was taken right below the Ford Dam, just upstream of the outlet of Minnehaha Creek in Minneapolis. So basically in the heart of the metro, within or adjacent to Minneapolis Park. So Mike Davis, who's, I think PFD is pictured there on the right, has this specially outfitted boat, and you got to dive for these mussels, and you bring them up to this sorting table, and you catalog every single one of them. So the thing about, this is where my sort of worlds intersect a little bit. I met Mike doing research for this book and went out on the boat with him and learned about mussels. And at the time, he was talking about the upper river of Minneapolis and how barge traffic was probably going to stop. And that would open up opportunities for mussel reintroduction. He was talking about the discussions that were happening about the long-term viability of the Ford Dam and what that would look like in the Mississippi Gorge. Flash forward a few years later, and I'm working for the park board, and I'm partly in charge of thinking of projects for which to apply for state funding. And we have partnered with Mike and submitted a significant grant to the Legislative Commission on Minnesota Resources, which was accepted by that committee, but is pending legislative action, to do a major restoration project and mussel reintroduction in the River First above the falls area that Tom mentioned at the very top of this conversation. So the interesting thing for me is thinking about how I got the opportunity to learn about all this science and participate in understanding this endangered species and how it works. And also now I get to also professionally continue to work with Mike on trying to really make that happen, like tangibly write policy and find funding so that we can do this in the Minneapolis park system. There is no park, be it urban or outstate, that can't benefit from thinking about these endangered species. And we have instances of them in Minneapolis parks. And I think that that's a really positive thing. These plants and animals are under our noses, and we can coexist with them even in an urban environment. And because it's always good to show pictures of baby animals, these are baby mussels, aren't under a microscope. Aren't they cute? You can see their shell and their little foot. I'm going to leave with a picture of climate change before I do a reading. These are mudflats in Texas, where the piping plover, a migratory bird, spends its winter, actually most of the year. These mudflats are disappearing. The Corpus Christi Bay area is experiencing some of the highest sea level rise in the world. And yet off in the distance there, you do see the oil platforms that also heavily populate this particular area. I went on some piping plover surveys down here in Texas, and we were experiencing some high tides that were submerging many of these mudflat areas where the birds spend their winters. And the birds were congregating very tightly together because there wasn't as much habitat for them. And so that's a real threat. And it sort of peppers throughout my book that climate change is, there are some specific and tangible things like actual, water quality and hunting and things like that that might have an impact on these species. But climate change is like this background noise that can have impacts on them all if it's not mitigated. And so the plover was a particular cautionary tale for me, seeing these mudflats at times completely buried in water and seeing these plovers congregated in very tight areas. So the Endangered Species Act to me is a story of both success and also a cautionary tale. There's a lot of saddening things when you start to dive into it. There's also a lot of positive work happening from some dedicated scientists who are spending their lives caring for these endangered species. And with that, I think we're going to switch over and do a couple of readings from my book. So I'm going to ask for some information on the poll and see how we've done.
Hi, good evening, Adam. Thank you so much for the wonderful presentation. Good evening, everyone attending today. Thank you so much for being with us. Yes, we had some great participation in the poll, and I'm going to share with you our top plant and our top animal. People would like to hear more about prairie butterflies, and they'd also like to hear about the Minnesota dwarf trout lily, which you mentioned before, but if you could do a reading from that, that would be great. And then just before you pop into that, I'd just like to remind everyone that we would love for you to submit questions. We have a couple that are in there now, and we're going to do our best to respond to those. But if other folks have questions, you can begin to formulate them, and please share them with us. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Jeanette. So yeah, the dwarf trout lily and the prairie butterflies. Those are good ones. So thank you for that. I'm going to start off with the trout lily. This is a little sort of non-seasonal for us here, but we'll go with it anyways, and you'll get a sample. This is actually part of the first chapter of the book, so you'll get a sample of where the book goes and how that works. So here we go. Minnesota dwarf trout lily. The fleeting upper Midwestern spring is a 5-week romance, cool, fresh, bright, and unfurling. Soon it will settle into the swelter and deep shade of June. The deciduous forest of south-central Minnesota transforms quickly and often from April through May. Plants and animals remember themselves in succession, remember that they are green beings after all, and that they can flower, or remember that they can sing, chortle, croak, cheep, chitter, hoot, and gobble. The woods are still open to traveling sounds, and the sun still comes all the way down to the duff. Now is the time to hurry if you're a woodland wildflower. Bloodroot or hepatica or jack in the pulpit, the leaf and umbrella will open soon. In the valley of Prairie Creek in April 2012, white trout lily carpets the hillsides. Yellow marsh marigold traces the seeping freshets, its glossy greenness like polished houseplants strewn on the browning leaves. Cutleaf toothwort of the rhythmic percussive name lives up to its moniker with jagged greenery and contrasts it with delicate white bullhorns. Virginia waterleaf looks shade-dappled even in full sun. A friend with whom I saw this plant told me her mother always called it Virginia Waterford, as if a stately British dame were reclining in the spring woods. Ferns, sedges, and wild ginger are cliquish, sticking to their own kind in pockets of some soil or other, some level of moisture or other, some ray of sunlight or other. And the ramps look like baby coconut palms, somehow too tropical in appearance for these bare woods. Collectively, these are the spring ephemerals. They run their yearly course before the maples, oaks, hickories, and lindens can leaf out. They drink in the spring sun, pack it all down into their roots, and by late June at the latest, with a few exceptions, give up their above ground existence. The forest floor in summer is shady and mostly brown. Spring is ephemeral. These woods are a manifestation of that. Go ahead and load up spring with symbolic meaning. Call it a newness, call it a fleeting romance, as I did a few paragraphs ago. Call it a resurrection. I see spring actually slipping away with every moment. Those deciduous leaves are coming on quickly. I walk down from the picnic area at Nurstrand Bigwoods State Park onto the boardwalk that winds between the trees, stepping always downward to Hidden Falls. The boardwalk is here to protect these delicate flowers, one in particular. The Minnesota dwarf trout lily is the most ephemeral of spring ephemerals. At the bottom of the boardwalk, the sign says the dwarf is here, but the actual colonies and individuals are not marked. That's okay. I like a search. I've been here before, but I don't remember exactly where they are. And that might not matter because a particular trout lily, this is true of white, yellow, and dwarf, might not flower in a given year and might not even put up leaves. Without the flower, it's impossible to tell the difference between dwarf and white. Their speckled leaves are identical in general size, color, and shape. Hunting dwarf trout lilies is like finding the smallest needle in a haystack made of needles. And now we are going to do butterflies. Here we go. Of all the amazing things that happen in nature, the growth of a redwood tree from a seed the size of a grain of mustard, the annual Arctic to Antarctic journeys of some birds, the likely ability of cephalopods to see with their skin, the fact that some frogs can freeze solid and then thaw out none the worse for wear. The most incredible may be the metamorphosis of butterflies and moths. Caterpillars alone would be a wonderful addition to our vibrant world of life. Caterpillars, however, get the rare opportunity to experience what it might be like to be two species in one lifetime. They make a chrysalis, maybe hanging from a leaf or branch, maybe in a hole in the ground, maybe nestled into the base of a clump of grasses. The chrysalis is made out of themselves. They use their own body fluids to make a hard shell around their tube-shaped body. Then, here's the true wonder of it. They dissolve. Everything inside that shell becomes a uniform soup. Scientists have cut open chrysalises at various stages of metamorphosis and found this is nearly universal. It's soup in there, caterpillar soup. Let me restate that because this is why I think the caterpillar to butterfly magic trick is the best in nature. The caterpillar is not gradually transforming into a butterfly in there. It's not sprouting wings and long, thin legs. It is not gradually changing color as leaves do. It's not dropping off those colorful appendages and leaving them on the floor. It is quite literally starting over. It is breaking down every structure, every membrane, every foot, eye, mouth, bit of skin, and organ into an undifferentiated swirl of cells. And then, out of the soup, a butterfly materializes. Somehow, within that cozy sheath, feet are made, feet that can taste flowers. A tongue sometimes as long as the whole body is formed. A body often thinner and smaller than the caterpillar's congeals. And wings, broad, soft, micron-thin wings with patterns and colors and iridescence. That the wings are made inside a watery space several times narrower than those wings is a true marvel. There is no equivalent of this miracle in nature, not even close. Assuming a typical caterpillar butterfly life cycle of about 6 months, imagine this: a human baby is born, eats nothing but spinach for 46 years, lies on the floor and covers itself in a shroud of spit, and stays inert that way for 12 years. Then out comes a bioluminescent, 12-armed starfish able to teleport to the moon. It is really that odd. Sometimes I wonder if all the butterflies and moths are the result of a truly clever and artistic creator, or the randomness of evolution gone absolutely haywire. It's nearly inconceivable that an animal can do this. I think that on some distant day, when we encounter life, intelligent or not, on some other planet, we will be amazed, of course, by what we find. But we'll also say, well, on Earth, we've got butterflies. Unless we don't. Unless we don't have butterflies on Earth. Thank you, everyone.
Okay, I'll applaud. It's the hard part about doing a virtual is you don't actually have the audience. And I have to say, that's just beautifully poetic. I laughed and then was really touched in, the space of 2 sentences. So thank you very much for that, Adam. I appreciate it. We have a lot of questions coming in, ranging from topics about policy all the way to some specifics about actual plants. So we're going to do our best to get in as much as we can. I'd like to start, though, with one of mine, if you don't mind.
Sure.
And specifically, you mentioned early on in your presentation this kind of conjunction of the creation of the Endangered Species Act, along with a lot of civil rights activities that was happening at the same time. And I think we find ourselves here in 2020 in a very similar sort of place. And I'm wondering if you could speak for a minute about parallels to what was happening in the 1960s and maybe where we're diverging from some of that now.
Yeah, thank you. That's a very big question, and it's true in the 50s, 60s, early 70s. The environmental movement and the civil rights movement were moving forward together, and that time period actually is indicative of another period 50 years before that, when there was yet another kind of environmental movement also. So there's a bit of a 50-year cycle that seems to recur throughout American history, and I believe we're experiencing that again. The linkage then between the civil rights movement and the environmental movement is actually still being explored by some historians. It wasn't perhaps at the time as explicit as we see it might have been now, though today I feel like those movements are being explicably linked. When we talk about racial equity, we are talking at the same time about access to nature, and some of the unrest that took place this summer here in Minneapolis also paralleled a situation in Central Park in New York City, where an African-American birder was accosted and essentially threatened with his life. And that kicked off a series of events, some of which I attended. There was a Audubon Society put on a Black Birders Week, and there were presentations about sort of what it was like to be a person of color in the wilds. And I think these things are really coming to the fore explicitly. It's exciting. I think the biggest thing that could happen here is that in parallel with the civil rights and the environmental movements, 50 plus 60 years ago, there was an outpouring of literature that was pushing both of these movements forward. And I do feel like that's happening again today. You have writers who are talking about the environment and racial equity at the same time. Terry Tempest Williams, Rebecca Solnit, J. Drew Lanham. These are folks that are explicitly linking these two important efforts together. Hopefully they will continue to stay linked. I do believe that the question of wilderness and parks and access to parks definitely has to do with equity, and it definitely has to do with a lot of the health outcomes that we are seeing creating disparities in our system. Parks and open space and wild space is an antidote to a lot of the health problems, and there has been disparity in access to that.
Thank you, I appreciate that. I think a question we have here from Catherine is related, and this is a lot more specific and sort of close to home. So I'll do my best to read and maybe paraphrase just a little bit. But she writes, your book explores the ways in which humans are interconnected with the natural world and the perils, and the perils faced a great deal of wildlife, plants, animals, and more who struggle to exist. How does your awareness of the current mass extinction and rapidly diminishing wildlife and biodiversity inform your work, and I would add the work of your colleagues at the Minneapolis Park and Recreation Board, as you look at our parks and natural areas here in Minneapolis?
Yeah, it's a great question. And the interesting history of it is that, I started writing this book and researching this book long before I joined the park board. And in some ways, it was a bit of a catalyst for that, because I studied landscape architecture and became a landscape architect through a natural lens. I wanted to design specifically national parks. I wanted to design wilderness spaces, as it were. And I had strayed a bit from that in my career. And during writing this book, I kind of took a big step back and reevaluated kind of what I was doing. At the time, I had my own firm that I was operating, and I didn't have a lot of park work. And I started to have conversations with some staff, with some folks at the park board, specifically Bruce Chamberlain, who I know has spoken as part of this series and has been a Parks Fellow was a Parks Fellow previously. And the vision of being able to reconnect with my desire to work on parks all the time and think about how parks and natural spaces can connect with people through a continuum of use. And I think about Edward Abbey here, another one of my big inspirational authors. And I thought that I wanted to investigate a bit more how policy can help make all of that happen. I am not a scientist. I'm not going to go into the field and create new research on these things, but I think what I can do is take an understanding of that science, almost maybe a translation of that science, and then try to put that into policy. And so specifically at the park board, recently the ecological system plan was adopted. And this is an aggressive vision to rethink the environmental performance of the park board from stem to stern. And it was 5 years in the making. It was one of the original reasons I came to the park board. There were many delays along the way. It's a complicated subject, but it is adopted policy now, and we are working to implement that. In addition, the comprehensive plan, Parks for All, which is out for public comment now, is actually proposing to change the mission statement of the park board to more explicitly talk about wildlife and plants. And it has an entire goal around connections, ecological connections in our system. And so these are things that I won't certainly take complete credit for, because the public and the community has been advocating for this all along. But I am proud to have a hand in that linkage to sort of see how does policy inform our ability to protect the environment and protect these species long term.
And I think we should say that some of that information is also available on the Minneapolis Park Board's website, some links to some of those policies and plans. And I believe also, at least as we're doing this event, I don't know if somebody's watching it later, but here in the fall, winter of 2020, that's still out for comment. And so you can find a link to actually review and comment on the Parks for All comprehensive plan on the Park Board's website.
Yeah, until January 18th.
Oh.
Public comment period till January 18th. Yep.
Thank you. Okay, that's fantastic. So I have a question here from someone that says, and I apologize because I think I'm going to pronounce this incorrectly. It says, are you familiar with the Miyawaki mini forest method, in which diverse native tree varieties are planted close together in a small space? And have you ever considered introducing this method in Minneapolis?
I'm going to have a very short answer, which is that I am intrigued, but I am not aware of this method. The park board's forestry department is more attuned to kind of common practices or new emerging practices in our forestry practices. So I don't get as involved in that, but Miyawaki, I will remember that and look it up. Thank you for the information. It sounds intriguing.
Well, okay, so thank you. We might end up challenging you a little bit more. We have a few other people who have put in species that they would like to hear a little bit more about. Why don't we start a little bit with prairie grasses? You obviously have the bush clover in your book, but could you talk a little bit about Minnesota's amazing prairies and specifically about prairie in Minneapolis or the Twin Cities?
Sure. So in the main chapter in the book about the prairie is the prairie bush clover, and the prairie bush clover is a relatively unassuming plant. And I think as I did the research on it and visited many sites where the prairie bush clover exists today, it really became kind of a stand-in for the prairie ecosystem as a whole. the Endangered Species Act was intended to protect species and the habitats in which they live. And by protecting the prairie, that is the only way we will protect the prairie bush clover. But in reality, the fact that the prairie bush clover is listed has had the result of protecting prairie across the state. Now, this is an ecosystem that is decimated. I cite in my book that the amount of prairie in the United States that was eliminated over a period of about 30 years is equivalent to half of the Amazon rainforest. So the scale of the ecosystem change that took place when settlers were given land that was not the nation's to give, and then fanned out across the United States through a very efficient and first of its kind in the world way of commoditizing land through the public land surveys and the Jeffersonian grid that, that is all over the landscape in the Midwest. The grid really converted that landscape entirely. It is important to restore these landscapes, and we hear a lot of desire to restore them in Minneapolis, in the city. And I think to some degree that is possible, but we are learning that they have to be treated more like gardens in Minneapolis than like self-sustaining ecosystems. The maintenance is still extremely high. Invasive species recruitment will always be there. So though we want to do this, we need to think about how they're going to be maintained long-term. But there are principles in several of those plans that I've already mentioned that do want to increase the amount of naturalized prairie, wet meadow, sedge meadow, forest understory areas in our park system, and reduce the amount of mown turf grass.
Great, thank you. So a couple more species questions for you, Adam. One is somebody would like to know where they could see the fringed orchid in bloom, or when they can see the fringed orchid in bloom.
Sure. So I'm gonna have to dodge that answer a little bit. And there's a good reason. So with this book, I wanted in most cases to sort of tell everyone exactly where I was. Mm-hmm. So that if you want to see a dwarf trout lily, you can go to Nurstrand, and with respect, you can walk down the boardwalk and you can see that plant. That is the only species that is only found here. The same is true of most of the species in this book. I was specifically sworn to secrecy on the location of Western prairie fringed orchids when I explored them. I was given some special dispensation because I was reporting data back for the scientists. They're in fairly remote locations in the far western part of the state. The narratives in the book, I actually specifically say in the book, boy, I'd love to tell you exactly where I was, but I cannot do so. So they grow most prevalently on the beach ridges of glacial Lake Agassiz, so kind of up in the west central plains of Minnesota. But as for specific sites, you will have to study up and understand their habitat and try your best. They bloom right around the 4th of July, and that's the best I can do.
There we go. Well, we can answer the when anyway.
The when.
Where. So I have another question here too about the bird's eye primrose, which is around Lake Superior. What do you know about that particular species?
I am not aware of that species. Is this is there any other information that the person is asking? Are they curious about it becoming a candidate species for the list, or?
Wondering about the ever shrinking area on the shore of Lake Superior. So not a very specific question, but.
Sure, I am not aware. So a species can be identified as being a candidate species for the endangered species list if there is scientific documentation that it is in decline. For instance, the monarch butterfly right now is a candidate species. However, the current administration has banned any expenditure of funds to do additional research to find out for sure. I don't know whether the primrose is a candidate species or not. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service does manage the endangered species list. And so their website has a good search feature where you can type in a species name and find out whether it's a candidate or whether it's endangered or threatened, and whether there are critical habitat areas that have been designated.
Great, thank you. That's a terrific resource to share with us. So let's see, I just want to share with you too, we have a number of different comments on here that I want to share where people are thanking you for your wonderful writing and for the terrific book, as well as some questions about where you can get the book. I want to say that we specifically partnered with Majors and Quinn, and I believe Adam was able to go in sometime in the last couple of weeks to sign some copies. So we would encourage you to make a purchase here locally, but I do believe it's widely available. Isn't that right, Adam?
It is widely available. Again, I would absolutely say, please support your local bookstore. They are up and running, and they can help you out. There's probably about 24 signed copies at Majors and Quinn right now. Those are going to be like first come, first served, other than the one that Tom is giving away as a prize. But of course, if you don't get a signed copy, they will have other stock that they can order or that they will have on the shelf. So Majors and Quinn is a great option. There are other independent bookstores that would be more than happy to order it for you.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak with you and ask these questions. Folks, we had a lot of really great questions here. I think it could inspire us to continue this conversation one way or the other coming up, but thank you so much for being here, and I will sign off. Good night.
Thank you, Jeanette. Well done. Great conversation, Adam, between the two of you. We really appreciate folks joining us tonight. And Adam, again, this is, I wish I could look out in the crowd because I know I'd get affirmations and hand claps, but we are really fortunate. And I think it's often maybe overlooked or undervalued how lucky we are in Minneapolis to attract talent like Adam. There's a lot of really incredible folks working in our park system, and Adam is one of them. And I think this book is blew me away when I read it, and I'm really delighted that we're able to share it with all of you. I think it makes a great gift this time of year. So I would encourage folks to do that and get one for yourself. But Adam, thank you so much for being part of this. It's really a delight. It's a joy to work with you as well and see both what see your passion come forward in the landscape that we enjoy here in Minneapolis. Thank you. So for all of you, thank you so much for sticking with us tonight, for joining us. Like I said, we want to point out that there are 2 more Next Generation of Park lecture events in this season. We do sort of a fall through spring season. This one is the first one of the 2020-2021 season. On February 6th at 3:00 via Zoom again, we're going to have Dudley Edmondson and Monica Bryan with our Minnesota-based wildlife photographers. And that's part of the Great Northern Festival. We're really glad to be part of that. Look for them. They're doing some great work in getting communities of color into nature. And there's going to be some discussion about birding and photography. So please join us for that and sign up so you can make sure you get notices. And then in April, we're really thrilled to another close at home friend of the Parks Foundation and a really great thinkers here in the Twin Cities, Sean Sherman and Dana Thompson, known widely as the sous chef, who will be opening a restaurant this spring at the Waterworks site, will be part of our Next Gen lecture series, where they'll talk about the foods, pre-settlement foods here on the nation, indigenous food, and some of the theories behind their work. And it's just fascinating stuff. Parks really connect us in so many different ways, whether it's through the natural environment or through culturally with each other. And in this time, it is so important that we get out and enjoy this the parks that we have around us, because and connect with each other through the space safely, of course. Please, if you're still looking at places to give, we definitely welcome your contributions. You can again give at mplsparksfoundation.org/donate. And if you can't find it, just Google us and send us a note. We'll be happy to help you. We are looking forward to celebrating some new parks, and we are just grateful for all the partners and all the donors who allow us to do this. This is really important work, and we're really privileged to be part of it. And thank you all for being part of it. So I really wish we could smile and see you after this and visit. And that's what I really love about the next generation of parks, is it brings a room full of folks who are interested and curious and thoughtful and connected. So until we can share space again, thank you. Happy holidays. And we look forward to seeing you in the new year. Feel free to keep sending us questions. And I think, let me just make sure. I am going to make one more note about the next gen on February 6th. It will be about birding, and it will be, the event is actually going to be family friendly. I think that's important to see. So it's at 3 o'clock. So if you've got kids who are interested in learning a little more about birding, connect them with that too. I want to make sure we make that note. So again, thank you all. I look forward to seeing you all as soon as it is appropriate. In the meantime, get out, enjoy those parks. Adam, thank you again so much for writing the book and for taking the time. It's really a true joy. Thank you.